Hello, and welcome to Aviation Republic. Now, I've probably said this about most of the airplanes I've covered, but I absolutely love the Buccaneer, and have always enjoyed reading the stories of her low-level antics. Flying at over 600 miles an hour at cowtop level, it was said that she was built for pilots with a fear of heights, because, as the joke goes, the Buccaneer raises her undercarriage so she can descend to operating altitude. So enamored was I by this big ugly duck of a jet that, as a young man a very long time ago, with less sense than a dog in a sausage factory, I would take a little Cessna 152 out over the North Sea to try and emulate the Buccaneer pilot's skill. But I could never get lower than a few hundred feet before I chickened out when the turbulence got a little too hairy. Allegedly. The Buccaneers would serve with the Royal Navy until they found a new home with the RAF, which, incidentally, they never wanted in the first place, but it's where they made a name for themselves with an impressive record in the First Gulf War. Also, controversially with the South African Air Force, they also showed our cousins across the pond what fast, low-level flying really looks like during the famous red flag exercises, which we'll cover later on in the video. So, here's to the pirate lady of the sky. I hope I've done her story justice. The life of the Buccaneer started back in the 1950s. This was the decade that is often described as the post-war golden age of the British aircraft industry. And at a time when the Cold War, now a distant memory, was escalating, Britain, with her allies, looked as though they were on the verge of nuclear war with the Soviet Union. An arms race between the Soviets and the Western powers was well underway. The Russians had just launched their Sverdlov class, a new type of fast, heavy gun cruiser, which were considered by NATO to be a real threat to shipping. These ships were fearsome and armed to the teeth. They were capable of launching torpedoes, missiles, and had no less than 32 anti-aircraft guns. These ships most definitely made Britain's naval chiefs nervous. Now, normally the doctrine would have been to build a fleet of similar warships, but with this being straight after the Second World War, Britain was on her uppers, and as poor as a church mouse, and the idea of building big, expensive ships to match or better the Soviets was totally out of the question. So to counter the threat, it was decided to build a carrier-based strike aircraft, drawing on the lessons of World War II, which had taught them the value of the reach and lethality of air power opposed to shipping. For this plan to work, they had to design an aircraft that had the range and punching power to counter the Soviet cruisers. Therefore, they needed to fly in at over 500 knots at 50 feet, below the natural horizon, skimming the waves, putting it out of reach of the Soviet service-based radar. Once it got within range of about 4 miles, the pilot would pull the aircraft into a steady climb, and a nuke would be lobbed at the ships. And because we're dealing with a nuclear weapon, the delivery did not have to be particularly accurate to obliterate them. It was a case of, sort of somewhere nearby ought to do the trick. There's a good chap. Way back in October 1953, the Admiralty issued Naval Staff Requirement NA-39 that outlined the need for a fast, low-level carrier-launched maritime strike aircraft capable of operations against both shore installations and warships, able to carry conventional, anti-ship, and of course everyone's party favorites, nuclear bombs. Then, in the following year, in March 1954, NA-39 requirement became Specification M14-8T. This specification set out the numbers expected for this aircraft. She was to have a maximum sea level speed of at least 550 knots at an altitude of 200 feet, a combat radius of 400 nautical miles at low altitude and 800 nautical miles at higher altitude. She had to have a weapons load of 4,000 pounds, with the primary weapon being the Green Cheese, a guided nuclear bomb designed for use against shipping, with the rather twitchy Red Beard nuclear bomb as an alternative party pooper. And not only that, be capable of being refueled in flight as well as acting as a refueling tanker. All of this was to be ready to go into service by 1960, which was a bit ambitious. This was still 1954, just 9 years after the end of the Second World War, when very fast, ultra-low-level attacking was still a relatively new concept. Among them were Armstrong Whitworth, Blackburn, Shorts, Westland, and Ferry, along with a dozen other companies also receiving invitations. Invitations were sent out for tender for the design and production of up to 20 aircraft. To a great degree, the dimensions of this new aircraft were dictated by the size of deck lifts on Royal Navy carriers, which restricted the aircraft's size and weight measurements. Therefore, when its wings were folded, the jet could be no more than 51 feet long and 20 feet wide in stowed configurations and weigh not greater than 20.4 tons or 45,000 pounds. I hope you're enjoying this video as much as I've enjoyed making it. A lot of time and effort went into researching this video, and I'd appreciate it if you could take a moment to hit the like button to feed the YouTube algorithm. This helps the channel grow and reach more people, and perhaps you'll consider subscribing for more aviation content. Now, back to the video. One of the many designs submitted was by the team from Blackburn, a company that had a tradition of building naval aircraft based in God's own country of Yorkshire. This team, led by Barry Late and Roy Boot, put forward the B.103. Blackburn's B.103 looked at the design requirements and deck lift restrictions and felt they needed a larger aircraft to fit in all the electronics which the Navy was demanding. So to accomplish this, they cheated a little by designing the nose that contained the radar to be folded back 180 degrees and a tail that could split into two petals to form an air brake. They also wanted to avoid having to build a complex wing with multiple folds, and because of this, the wingspan of the B.103 was to be 45 feet with an area of 650 feet. This gave rise to a new problem. This wing configuration would not be able to produce the lift needed during launch from a carrier. Various ideas were put forward. One of them was to fit the B.103 with the powerful Armstrong-Siddeley Sapphire ASSA-7 engine capable of producing 11,000 pounds of thrust, which would have had a system of cowls providing jet deflection, whereby the cowls would be pointed downwards during catapult launches. However, this idea was scrapped due to the weight concerns of the Sapphire engine. The answer to the lift problem came in two parts. The first was the discovery of a phenomenon called boundary layer control. It was discovered that increasing airflow sourced by bleeding high-pressure air from the engines over the wing control surfaces prevented the airstream from breaking away. As a result, this airflow provided more lift at lower speeds, allowing approach speeds to be reduced by up to 15 knots, reducing wing area and span, and potentially smaller engines could be used. The second part of the answer was finding a smaller engine with a better thrust-to-weight ratio. Initially, Blackburn determined that a 7,000-pound thrust engine would do the trick, so opted for the de Havilland Gyron Junior Mark 101 turbojets, which as well will be seen later was a poor choice. But for now, the boundary layer control solved the issue of lift at a low speed and also had the added benefit of acting as anti-icing protection. In the end, 6 major British aircraft manufacturers submitted proposals, and by December 1954, Tender Design Conference, these proposals had been whittled down to 3 finalists: the Armstrong-Whitworth AW168, the Shorts PD-13, and the Blackburn B.103. One of the favourites was Armstrong's Whitworth's AW168, which was a very conservative design with a conventional layout, moderately swept wings, and 2 de Havilland Gyron Junior turbojet engines mounted in nacelles attached to the wings, which was promised to be ready for service by 1960. The entry from Shorts was the unique and unusual PD-13, which lacked a tail and featured a sophisticated, sharply angled aero-isoclinic wing created by Professor Geoffrey Hill of Shorts. As we now know, Blackburn won and was given the go-ahead on July 5, 1955. The reason Blackburn won, I have read, used the Goldilocks line of logic. The AW168 was too cold, even though it would present the least risk and get into service the soonest. It was considered by late 1960s it would be outdated. The Shorts PD-13 was just too hot. It was the most advanced of the designs and also the riskiest choice, since the Shorts design offered too many risky innovations without offering clear advantages. The Blackburn B.103, however, was just right, neither too cold nor too hot. A contract for 20 development batch aircraft, now referred to as the NA-39 to reflect the original naval requirement, was signed that year on August 5th. The Buccaneer would be the company's only foray into jet aircraft, and the last from Blackburn. This was an impressive order for a pre-production aircraft, but the Royal Navy was keen to get their jet into service. The reasoning was that the 20 airframes would be divided into batches to perform specific tasks. Some would be tasked with development flying, some would be deployed for clearance trials, and some would be allocated to service trials directly with the Royal Navy. The thinking behind this was that the program would not be delayed in the event of the loss of one or two prototypes. Have you ever wondered why the Buccaneer is quite so curvy? Well, this is due to the aerodynamic principle of area rule, which, when applied, enhances high-speed performance by avoiding sudden shifts in the aircraft's cross-sectional area, thereby reducing drag as the aircraft approaches Mach 1, giving the crew a much smoother ride. Very important when flying at 550 knots a few dozen feet above the deck. This meant that the fuselage tapered where the wings were attached to the body, and then widened again afterwards. Imagine a Coke bottle with wings, and two big toilet tubes on either side for the engines, with a bulged rear end to increase the cross-sectional area that tapered off to a wasp-like tail, creating a sleek, curvaceous body. Early on, the Blackburn engineers understood they needed to build an immensely strong aircraft that could withstand the structural stresses and airframe fatigue caused by the severe buffeting of high-speed, low-level flight that was expected during almost every sortie. The idea that the engineers came up with was to build the N-39 out of solid steel. Okay, maybe not a block of flying steel, but close. To provide structural strength, it was decided to construct the two main load-bearing spars of the wing, spanning from wingfold to wingfold, from single solid steel billets, as well as stiffened machine skins to strengthen the wings. The issue now was how to do this in practice, since the mills or tools to produce stiffened machine skins did not exist in the UK. Blackburn turned to the Americans to help in manufacturing the mills and presses to make the load-bearing structures, but unfortunately were told that it would be between 2 to 3 years before the mills would be ready for delivery to the UK. So Blackburn, with a little bit of Yorkshire determination, built their own steel milling machines in-house. As a result, the N-39 had load-bearing spar frames milled from solid steel blocks, which made it stronger and more rugged than anything built beforehand. These frames were milled with steel rings through which the gyron engines would be fitted along with heavy longerons running through the center and bottom edge of the weapons bay. Without a doubt, the airframe was designed with an emphasis on strength, so it's no surprise that the Buccaneer was described as being built like a brick outhouse. The wings were a thing of beauty. They had a unique sweep angle, starting at around 40 degrees at the root and changing to 30 degrees further out, and could fold 120 degrees for carrier storage. With this design, the critical Mach number was nearly constant across the entire wingspan. The wings had conventional ailerons and trailing edge flaps where the ailerons could droop to work with the flaps, creating a full-span trailing edge flap system. The all-moving tailplane supported flaps that moved in sync with the aileron droop, and there was also a full-span trailing edge flap on the tailplane. The B.103 also did away with a conventional hinged bomb bay door. Instead, weapon loads were carried internally on a rotating bomb bay door that rotated 180 degrees when close to the target. The bombs were dropped, and the door rotated closed. Initially, the Buccaneer was intended to carry Fairy Green's Cheese tactical nuclear missile, but this was cancelled in 1956. It was replaced by the Red Beard Mark II, an unguided nuclear bomb with a 25 kiloton yield, which in turn was replaced by the WE-177A, a more advanced treefall bomb, which became the UK's primary airdrop nuclear weapon into the 1990s, that could be deployed using low-level toss bombing. The Buccaneer S.1, the first version, could carry a conventional load of 4 1,000-pound bombs internally and 4 more on underwing pylons, although some pylons were often used for fuel tanks. Smaller bombs like the 500-pounder and 540-pounder could be loaded on tandem carriers. The cockpit was equipped with a pair of Martin Baker ejection seats in a tandem arrangement, offset from each other. The navigator seat is a little higher than the pilot's position and is 2 inches right of center, and the pilot seat is 2 inches left. This gives the nav sat in the back a reasonably clear view forward of the pilot's right shoulder. Interestingly, there never was a dual-control Buccaneer, so training of the aircraft was carried out in Hunters equipped with a Buccaneer cockpit. The windshield itself was incredibly strong, made from 6.35 centimeter thick laminate that could withstand bird strikes. It has been said that the Buck had a windscreen riper to clear grass clippings from the windshield. There's also another windshield separating the 2 positions that was installed to deflect air once the canopy was ejected, as it was discovered that when the canopy was jettisoned above 250 knots, the fast-moving mass of air made it very unpleasant in the rear and difficult for the navigator to eject, as was soon discovered. In March 1958, the N-39 aircraft, XK-486, emerged from its jig sans folding wings and with the most basic systems installed to start its initial engine tests at the Blackburn factory at Bruff. But the length of the runway at Bruff, being 3,500 feet, caused some concern that the aircraft would need a longer run to get airborne. Therefore, it was decided to disassemble and transport XK-486, hidden under wraps 18 miles by road to a disused Second World War bomber station at RAF home on Spalding Moor, which had a 6,000-foot runway. However, the Air Ministry thought that 6,000 feet was not enough, and it was suggested to Blackburn that they needed an even longer runway, something in excess of 9,000 feet. In the end, RAF Airfield at Phutully, Bedford, which had a 10,600-foot runway, was selected, only because it was the closest, so they once again disassembled and transported XK-486 under wraps by road to Phutully, where she was made ready to fly by early April. Once at Phutully, the testing program started with high-speed taxi trials at full power. It was during one of these high-speed taxi runs, Blackburn's chief test pilot, Lieutenant Commander Derek Whitehead at the controls, applied full brake pressure at 100 knots. As the aircraft slowed the brakes, overheated and caught fire. Whitehead steered the aircraft on the runway onto the grass, and as the aircraft came to a halt, the starboard tire burst, damaging the underside of the inner wing. After some repairs, XK-486 was back performing taxi trials on the 29th of April, and the very next day had a flawless maiden flight, which lasted 39 minutes, reaching an altitude of 17,000 feet, with Derek Whitehead flying and head of Blackburn's flight test Bernard Watson on board. This was impressive when considering the aircraft had gone from winning the contract to wheels up in just 33 months, and in September the same year, the Navy's new strike aircraft made her public debut at the Farnborough Air Show. In 1958, Blackburn leased the RAF home on Spalding Moor when it was determined that the aircraft was capable of being safely operated from a 6,000-foot runway. It was from here that all future N-39 aircraft would be tested. Once built, the aircraft would be towed to home. But as a precaution, the runway was fitted with arrestor gear, which surprised one pilot during a takeoff run when the arrestor system was accidentally activated and the tailhook was accidentally dropped, catching the arrestor cable, bringing the aircraft to an abrupt halt. On October 12, 1959, XK-490, the fifth NA-39, the first aircraft to be fitted with a rotating bomb bay door, crashed near Lyndhurst, Hampshire. Both crew, American NASA test pilot William Oldford and Blackburn observer John Joyce, were killed when they ejected while inverted shortly before the aircraft impacted the ground. The investigation, which relied on eyewitness accounts and examination of the wreckage, showed that the aircraft was being flown in a blown-on configuration, with 45 degrees of flap, 20 degrees of aileron droop, and 20 degrees of tailplane flap, while simultaneously simulating a single-engine flight, a configuration which had not yet been tested. XK-490 stalled at 10,000 feet, a stall which Alford could not recover from despite his and Joyce's ejecting. The inverted dive was beyond the safe limits of their ejection seats. Further investigation showed that a faulty non-return valve may have failed, causing an engine malfunction. The loss of XK490 delayed the NA-39's initial carrier trials, which finally began in January 1960 aboard HMS Victorious in the English Channel with XK489, the first airframe to be navalized, with folding wings, nose, and an arrestor hook. Over 3.5 days, 31 deck landings were performed in poor weather, which caused some heart-stopping moments as the launched aircraft dipped below the level of the flight deck. In August of that year, the Navy officially designated the new aircraft as S Mark I, with the S indicating its nuclear strike capability. Although Blackburn had been scratching their heads to come up with a name, until then it was referred to as the N39, or, for a while, in the interests of maintaining secrecy, was referred to as BNA, for Blackburn Naval Aircraft, or ARNA, another Royal Navy aircraft. Then it became Blackburn Advanced Naval Aircraft, or BANA, which led to its nickname, Banana, a name which stuck with the Buccaneer throughout her career. Although much to the annoyance of her crew, the press liked to refer to her as the Brick. But the name Buccaneer was chosen. She was to be the pirate. On October 5th, 1960, XK486, the first NA-39 airframe, crashed. It was a shame since it was the failure of a single instrument and not a failure of the aircraft that resulted in her loss. The aircraft was at the time being flown by Deputy Chief Test Pilot Gartrell Sailor Parker. At the time, he was climbing through cloud when the artificial horizon started rolling to the right. Parker, to counter what he believed to be the aircraft turning, pushed the stick to the left. What he didn't know was that the artificial horizon had failed. This disorientated him, and believing the plane to be out of control, he closed the throttles and ejected. However, Nightingale in the rear seat was unable to reach the ejection handles due to the 300-knot airstream catching his arm and pulling him up the seat, which meant he could not reach the alternative handle, which was located between his knees. But after XK486 flew for a further minute or so, she had slowed enough to pull himself down the seat to reach the alternate handles between his knees and eject to safety, after which the aircraft flew on for a bit, on its own with no crew, and came down in the open countryside. I had to dig around a bit for this, but it seems that he was sitting in the back of the aircraft with no pilot and no controls. Please, if you know anything different, let me know in the comments. Anyway, due to this accident, all aircraft were fitted with a standby artificial horizon. There was a further loss when XK529, the unlucky 13th production aircraft, named 12A to avoid superstitions, crashed on August 31st, 1961, during trials aboard HMS Hermes, when she was catapulted from the carrier sailing in Lyme Bay, Dorset. Only a second after leaving the deck, the aircraft pitched up violently and stalled, crashing into the sea no more than a mile from the ship, killing Lieutenant Commander Ossie Brown and observer Terry Dunn. Although the cause of the crash has never been fully established, it was suspected that the aircraft had been over-trimmed, causing it to pitch up and over-rotate during a catapult launch, although it has been suggested that the BLC system may have failed during launch. While it might seem strange to my American viewers, the catapult attachment was not placed on the nose wheel. Instead, there were hooks for a bridle cable beneath each engine housing. When preparing for a carrier takeoff, the plane is secured with a bridle, causing the nose wheel to lift off the deck, which allows the aircraft to achieve a high angle of attack during a hands-off launch from the carrier. Though this setup looked cumbersome, it was successfully used with other Royal Navy jets. Despite losing 3 aircraft, flight clearance went smoothly, but the jet did experience minor directional issues at speeds over 520 knots, or Mach 0.9, and one of the test aircraft also had severe tailplane vibrations at these speeds. The investigation revealed shock-induced separation at the fin and tailplane junction, solved by adding a wasted bullet. Starting in March 1961, the Intensive Flying Trials Unit, designated 700Z Flight, was formed at RNAS Lossiemouth. 700Z Flight was a trial squadron, dedicated to putting the aircraft through its paces, operating day and night to understand the aircraft's performance across different ranges, how she operates at altitude, high speed, low altitude, and engine performance, basically putting her through her paces and into service as quickly and smoothly as possible. Some of the Buccaneers were being painted overall anti-flash white, a sign they were getting to grips with the nuclear strike role. Have you ever wondered why the Buccaneer has that rather long fixed refueling probe sticking out of her nose? Although in-flight refueling was not deemed to be vital for the Navy, since the Buccaneer already had a respectable range, it was decided to have it in the event of an emergency, such as diversions due to poor weather and such. Initially, the Blackburn team had designed a retractable probe that rotated 90 degrees out of the nose to the 11 o'clock position in front of the pilot. But during testing, it was found that the Buccaneer's nose created a bow wave that pushed the refueling basket away from the probe. Not only that, but the airflow disturbances created by the basket and probe caused the engine compressor to stall. To fix the issue, the Blackburn engineers fiddled with the length of the probe to be more upright and extend further from the nose, which did nothing to improve the issues with the compressor stall and bow wave effect. In the end, they just threw up their hands and bolted on a fixed probe. That's proper Yorkshire engineering. The first Buccaneer S.1 took flight on January 23, 1962, with the Fleet Air Arm taking delivery of the first Buccaneer in August 1961, and on the 17th of July 1962, No. 801 Naval Air Squadron was commissioned at RNAS Lossiemouth in Scotland, which, after working up, joined HMS Ark Royal on 20th February 1963, painted in grey and white. The squadron then transferred to HMS Victorious in August 1963 and headed to the Far East. The Buccaneer S.1 would go on to serve with 800 Squadron and 809, the Immortal Squadron. Much work was done on the control system during the development of the S.1, which resulted in an aircraft that many pilots said was smooth, enjoyable to fly, and a solid ride right down on the deck, with pilots remarking that once settled into low altitude and high-speed flight, the ride was smooth, like riding on rails, with pilots being able to take her down to 10 to 20 feet at speeds of 550 knots. Despite this, the most significant shortcoming of the Buccaneer S.1 was its de Havilland Gyron Junior turbojets, which were regarded as an interim solution until something suitable came along. So until the perfect engine was available, the Navy was provided with an almost perfect aircraft in a reasonably short timescale. Fleet Air Arm pilots converting from the Sea Vixen and Scimitars were surprised by the sluggish takeoff performance. And to quote Unit Commander Lieutenant Commander E.R. Anson, takeoffs were adequately exciting and events were frequent enough to avoid a feeling of boredom. However exciting as the launches may have been, the Gyrons would ultimately be the type's Achilles heel and result in just 40 S.1 examples being built. Although the aircraft performed well once airborne, the Gyron Junior turbojets were just too underpowered, to the point that the S.1 couldn't operate from carriers with a full load of 1,000-pound bombs or a combination of full external fuel tanks and 6,000-pounders. To fix this problem, 800B Squadron of 4 Supermarine Scimitar F-1s modified for air-to-air refueling were formed, and were taken on board HMS Eagle to provide refueling services for 800 Squadron Buccaneers during their patrol of the East African coast. The routine was for the S-1 to take off with a relatively small amount of fuel and climb to meet a Scimitar with its drogue extended, waiting to refuel the Buccaneer. Problems with the Buccaneer S.1's Gyron Junior engines were the cause of 2 further losses. The first one happened on December 1st, when an engine failed on an S.1 as it tried to recover from a poorly judged landing, forcing the crew to eject. Then shortly after, on December 8th, another S.1 experienced a catastrophic engine failure during a training flight. Although the pilot ejected successfully, the navigator tragically died due to a malfunction in his ejection seat. Inspections after these incidents determined that the Gyron engines were unsafe, leading to all remaining S.1 aircraft being immediately and permanently grounded. Despite the problems with the S.1, she compensated for her shortcomings by being an agile aircraft, which handled pretty well and was really inferior to the S.2 in terms of range. However, she paved the way for the world-class and superior Buccaneer S.2. As early as January 1960, Blackburn, the Air Ministry, and the Royal Navy met to discuss the need to re-engine the Buccaneer. There were 3 engine options to be considered. The first was an upgraded Gyron Junior engine able to produce around 10,700 pounds of thrust, although it would almost be 2,000 pounds heavier. At the same time, Bristol Siddeley had just developed their Orpheus BS-55, capable of producing 9,000 pounds of thrust, although this would be reduced to nearly 8,000 pounds when boundary layer control was enabled. In the end, the Rolls-Royce Spey RB1681A non-afterburning engine was selected, and it was expected to produce around 11,200 pounds of thrust, 60% more than the approximately 7,000 pounds produced by the Gyrons, or about 9,500 pounds with BLC activated, and being less thirsty had the added benefit of increasing the Buccaneer's maximum range by around 80%. The choice of engine was also in large part dictated by the main spar, which had ringed sections that went around the jet pipe of the Gyron engines, and to avoid a very expensive redesign, an engine with a smaller or at least identical jet pipe diameter had to be found. And interestingly, the Rolls-Royce Spey fit relatively easily into the existing airframe's spar rings. Although it was not just a case of dropping in the new engines, larger elliptical intakes were needed to handle the increased airflow, along with the exhaust jet pipes being changed to tow outward and downward. The first 10 production S2s, originally ordered as S1s in September 1959, were followed by additional orders throughout the 1960s. 2 development batch airframes, XK526 and XK527, were rebuilt and re-engined to prepare the new version. Along with the engine upgrade, the S2 had a completely new and upgraded and much needed electrical system installed, with 2 constant speed and 30 kVA alternators, and avionics systems, which included a Honeywell inertial navigation. To increase crew safety and survivability, the S2 was fitted with a miniature detonation cord, MDC, embedded within the canopy, to shatter it simultaneously with the ejection seat firing, and designed to work while submerged. The boundary layer control system also got an update, and now it could blow over the inner wing, which helped further to reduce the Buccaneer's takeoff and landing speeds. Speaking of wings, they too were modified by replacing the original square-cut wingtips with triangular ones, which further improved the cruising range, although these extended tips were removed and reverted back to the square-cut ones after a catastrophic failure of the main front spar caused by stresses which had not previously been detected. The Royal Navy was so confident that the re-engined Buccaneer S2 was to be a much superior aircraft to the S1 that in January 1962, they placed a production order for the S2 even before the S1 entered squadron service. With the conversions complete, the first Spey-powered Buccaneer, once more with Derek Whitehead at the controls, flew on the 17th of May 1963 from home on Spalding Moor. With the new engines, the S2 had a maximum speed of 580 knots or 667 miles an hour at sea level. I'll put the performance numbers up on screen for you. Flight testing progressed smoothly, with 8 aircraft being sent to 700B Intensive Flying Trials Unit in April 1965 at Lossiemouth, which disbanded that September to be replaced by No. 801 Naval Air Squadron in October. In the meantime, carrier trials had started in March 1965, and it was expected that 100 launches and landings were to be performed. However, the test was concluded after 78 were carried out on HMS Ark Royal with various weapons and fuel loads in just 2 weeks, after which the S2 was given the green light for carrier operations. Later in 1965, 3 Buccaneers were sent to the US Navy Pensacola Air Base for hot and high weather trials, which included 100 carrier launches of USS Lexington. The improved fuel efficiency of the Spey engines was demonstrated when XN974, piloted by Commander Higgs and Lieutenant Commander Taylor, became the first Royal Navy aircraft to fly across the Atlantic non-stop without refueling, when it flew from Goose Bay in Labrador, Canada, to Lossiemouth, a distance of 1,950 miles in 4 hours and 16 minutes. Another dramatic demonstration of the Buccaneer's outstanding range occurred when Lieutenant K.B. Koss launched from HMS Victorious in the Irish Sea and flew 2,300 miles non-stop to Gibraltar to demonstrate a low-level target marker bomb long toss. In late March 1967, the Buccaneers of 800 and 736 NAS, supported by Hunters and Sea Vixens, carried out their only successful destruction of a large ship by bombing the oil tanker Torrey Canyon, which had run aground near Land's End in Cornwall. The aim was to crack open the ship to release the oil, which would be burnt, although the so-called experts who advised the operation did not realize that oil mixed with seawater would make it almost impossible to burn. Anyway, to start the operation, 8 Buccaneers from No. 736 Squadron struck the ship with 1,000-pound HE bombs, 30 of which were direct hits, holing the tanker. Once the oil was pouring out of the superstructure, the RAF Hunters came in with fuel air bombs to burn off the oil. Despite being pummeled by both the Royal Navy and RAF, the Torrey Canyon was still afloat the next day. So once again, the RAF deployed Hunters that attacked with napalm and rocket. These were followed closely behind by Buccaneers from No. 736 Naval Air Squadron. Lieutenant J. Todd scored an impressive hit when he managed to place a bomb directly down the Torrey Canyon's funnel. Later that day, the Buccaneers were joined by 4 Sea Vixens, which set about with the Buccaneers bombing the tanker once again. After 3 days, having delivered 165 1,000-pound bombs and about 40,000 gallons of incendiaries, the tanker finally succumbed to the military onslaught. Just at the time when the S.2 ended service with the Royal Navy, with No. 801 Squadron in October 1965, when in 1966, grey clouds began to gather. It seemed that the days of the large aircraft carriers were coming to an end, as the new Labour government Defence Review cancelled the planned CVA-01 carrier, which was vital for operating aircraft like the Buccaneer, Sea Vixen and Scimitar, which required the catapult launch systems, marking the beginning of the end for the existing Royal Navy carrier force. The Buccaneers saw service when HMS Eagle took over from HMS Ark Royal just in time for Rhodesia's declaration of independence in March 1966. During this period, aircraft from 800 NAS aboard HMS Eagle participated in the Beira Patrol, which was the naval blockade aimed at restricting oil supplies to Rhodesia. During this time, the Royal Navy had not been hanging around for the axe to fall, and in 1968 updated the Buccaneers with true 00 Martin Baker Mark 6 MSB ejection seats, and more importantly, the S2s had their wings strengthened and new larger pylons added to carry the 4 Anglo-French Martel, one on each pylon. There were 2 versions, the AS-37 anti-radar missile and the AJ-16-8, with a television seeker for targeting ships. This new missile needed the navigator's station to be modified to fit in the television display and joystick controller for the AJ-168 Martel. However, the TV-guided version became obsolete by the mid-1980s. Although the anti-radar variant remained in service until the Buccaneer was retired in 1994. I once read on some forum the cockpit described as an ergonomic slum by a lecturer in systems engineering, and it certainly was not optimized for anything resembling human factors. With the Sea Vixens being phased out and the US Phantoms replacing them, the Buccaneers of 809 NAS operated from the last Royal Naval carrier, HMS Ark Royal. In 1973, RNAS Lossiemouth was handed over to the RAF, and Buccaneers, both newly built S-2Bs with Martel missile capability and ex-Navy S-2As with partial modifications, entered RAF service. Hawker Siddeley, which had merged with Blackburn, introduced a bulged bomb bay door for an extra 440 gallons of fuel storage. The Buccaneers remained in Navy service longer than expected and were upgraded to S-2C and S-2D standards. Improvements in electronic countermeasures developed for the RAF were also applied to Navy Buccaneers in July 1970. 801 NAS on HMS Hermes disbanded, followed by 800 NAS and 736 NAS when HMS Eagle was decommissioned in 1972. When HMS Ark Royal was decommissioned in 1978, its Buccaneers and Phantom were transferred to the RAF, leading to the disbandment of 809 NAS. The Buccaneer was considered to be a top-notch aircraft, and there was significant interest from West Germany, who wanted at the time to replace their fleet of Seahawks, but due to typical British government inefficiencies and abundant incompetence, which is a complete story on its own, led to the West German government decision to go with the Lockheed F-104G Starfighter, which, considering that the F-104 is not a low-level strike aircraft, makes you wonder what the Germans were thinking. And so the Buccaneer missed its opportunity to join the Marineflieger. Another reason given as to why the Buccaneer did not attract any export orders was feeling from foreign air forces that if the RAF was not interested, then there must be a reason. They must have been kicking themselves after realizing how successful the Buccaneer turned out to be. Also, the Americans were approached to see if they would be interested in buying the aircraft, having helped so much in the development process and recognized the Buccaneer's potential. But once again, British government's incompetence stepped in and scuppered the deal. Eventually, the US opted for the Grumman A6 Intruder. Eventually, Hawker Siddeley managed to secure one export order for the Buccaneer, when in January 1963, South Africa awarded a contract for 16 Buccaneers with orders for a further 20 aircraft, designated as S-50 based on the Navy S.2 model. During that period, the UK had a good business relationship with South Africa, upheld by the Simonstown Agreement, which allowed Britain to supply military equipment for the defense of shipping around the Cape of Good Hope following the closure of the Suez Canal in 1956. It was deemed of vital importance to Europe and the USA. Despite this agreement being controversial due to South Africa's apartheid policy at the time, it was considered reasonable to allow South Africa to have the aircraft patrol the seas. Number 24 Squadron SAAF, with the slogan, "Hit the floor, it's 24, had secretly trained with 809 NAS since January 1965 in Buccaneer S1s, until the first S-50 were ready, and continued to train with the Fleet Air Arm until they were operationally capable. In 1965, the first of 8 Buccaneers departed Lossiemouth for delivery to South Africa. However, near the Canary Islands, the aircraft stalled and crashed into the sea due to loss of control. Fortunately, the crew ejected safely and were rescued. After this crash, the remaining Buccaneers were to be transported by sea, arriving in South Africa in 1966. But the fact they arrived was a miracle, since at that time, the political winds had changed, and there had been new Labour government installed in 1964. They wanted to adhere to an arms embargo against South Africa set out by the United Nations, but the following protests from the South African government, the original 16 Buccaneers were delivered. But the further 20 they had an order on would be cancelled, including the replacement for the Buccaneer which crashed near the Canary Islands. However, the Labour government had no words of disapproval for Italy and France, which continued to supply weapons to South Africa. Roy Boot of Blackburn was quoted as saying, "Those who wanted it were not allowed to have it, and those who would have been didn't want it, having been influenced by the failure of the Royal Air Force to adopt it at the time." South Africa's 15 Buccaneer S-50s retained their deck hooks and manually folding wings. They could carry 430 gallons of underwing fuel tanks or an air-to-air refueling pod, which is essential for maritime operations given South Africa's surrounding waters. The S-50's armament included 1,000-pound bombs and Nord AS-20 and AS-30 air-to-surface missiles for precision strikes. In late 1974, they were also equipped with an S-2B-style bomb bay fuel tank. The most significant modification from the S-2 was the addition of 2 rocket-assisted takeoff Bristol Siddeley BS-605 motors, positioned in the rear of each engine nacelle beneath the main jet pipe. These rockets operated for 30 seconds, enabling takeoff from hot and high airfields. Although the RATO worked well, it was rarely used in practice, except for occasional air display demonstrations, as Waterkloof's runway was long enough for fully loaded Buccaneers. The SAAF Buccaneers played a role in the Southwest African Border War, a conflict from 1966 to 1990. During the 1970s and 1980s, these aircraft conducted missions over Angola and Namibia. Their most significant impact was during the Battle of Kasinga, a story which I would love to cover in great deal one day. The crew who flew her appreciated the aircraft's excellent low-level handling, range, and weapons capability. The SAAF flew those Buccaneers hard too, many of them succumbing to accidents, and by 1978, only 6 SAAF Buccaneers remained. Blackburn had been trying to persuade the RAF long before the Buccaneer entered service with the Royal Navy to buy their jet. The RAF was holding out for the supersonic TSR-2, which they considered to be the more sophisticated option. But as we know, the TSR-2 project was cancelled in 1965. But this, as you can appreciate, is a topic all on its own. During this time, Blackburn merged with Hawker Siddeley and started working on significant new designs after the TSR-2 was cancelled. Among the new designs was the supersonic Buccaneer P150, with twin afterburning Spey engines capable of Mach 1.8. This jet would have had the extended fuselage and new wings for long-range missions. But again, the RAF turned their noses up at the suggestion, as they were now interested in the nuclear-capable General Dynamic F111K, of which they ordered 50, which, like the TSR-2, was designed to fly fast under Soviet radar, and like the TSR-2 was itself also cancelled due to increasing costs, forcing the service to now cast around for a replacement that was available and affordable. In the end, the RAF came around and wearily ordered the S.2 Buccaneers, with an order for 17 more to add to the Buccaneers that the RAF was set to inherit from the Navy. At the time, the RAF thought that the Buccaneer was a stopgap until they could find a replacement, but ultimately ended up operating the jet for over 2 decades. The new RAF version was designated the S.2B, which had Martel capability. However, there were several variants of the S.2. Firstly, there was the S.2A, which were ex-Royal Navy S.2 models reworked for RAF use, but did not have the modified wing pylons needed to carry Martel missiles. Then came the S.2C, which were Royal Navy aircraft upgraded to the S.2A standard. Finally, there was the S.2D, which was a Royal Navy aircraft upgraded to the S.2B standard and equipped with Martel missiles. Finally, in October 1969, No. 12 Squadron, the first Royal Air Force Buccaneer Squadron, formed at Huntington with modified ex-Fleet Air Arm S.2s. They were joined by 208 Squadron with Buccaneer S.2As a few years later in 1974. In 1970, the famous No. 15 Squadron was reformed and received the first new-build S.2B aircraft based at RAF Larbrook. In October 1972, 16 Squadron joined them at Larbrook. Both squadrons were pure bomber forces tasked with targeting airfields and command centers in East Germany and Poland, and given their range, even targets in the Soviet Union. Buccaneers had the option to carry a single AIM-9B Sidewinder missile, but these early versions weren't very effective and offered minimal self-defense. To protect themselves, Buccaneer pilots had another tactic. They could release a 450-kilogram parachute-retarded bomb while flying low over the water to deter pursuing fighters. This method was called retard defense, or just dropping your knickers. Buccaneer was soon equipped with the Paveway 2 laser-guided bomb and was the RAF's standard light laser-guided bomb until the 1990s. It was based on a standard 1,000-pound bomb with pop-out control fins to extend its range after release. These bombs were guided using the Pave Spike AVQ-23E laser designation pod. Buccaneers carrying the Pave Spike were capable of guiding laser-guided bombs for other Buccaneers, Jaguars, and Tornadoes. During the 1980s, the Buccaneer was updated. This included new avionics and the ability to carry 4 BAE Sea Eagle self-guiding sea-skimming missiles, which carried a 506-pound semi-armor piercing warhead. Chaff dispensers and flares were installed, and for airborne defense, Buccaneers were equipped to carry AIM-9G or the all-aspect AIM-9L Sidewinder missile, and were occasionally credited with kills on fighters during red flag exercises, thanks to the AIM-9L. Although the Buccaneer never actually shot down an adversary aircraft with one. In 1977, the No. 208 Squadron would be the first RAF unit, and in fact the first non-US participants to be invited to participate in the USAF Red Flag exercises at Nellis AFB, Nevada. As 208 Squadron was the only overland Buccaneer unit that practiced air-to-air refueling, it was tasked to ferry aircraft to and from Nellis and participate in the first 2-week period, with crews from 15 and 16 squadrons taking over for the second portion. 10 aircraft were dispatched painted in two-tone desert brown to help them blend into the Nevada landscape during low-level flight on August 2, 1977, via Goose Bay for an overnight stop, then off to Nellis the next day. However, the paint scheme was unnecessary, since the Buccaneers took the Americans by surprise and outflew every other unit during the exercise by flying at extremely low levels, which never exceeded 100 feet and sometimes going at as low as 20 feet, at speeds approaching 580 knots. In an interview with Ken Norman, a Buccaneer pilot at Red Flag, he said, "We were flying over the flat desert. We descended down to about 10 feet at 550 knots, but we found at that height we're actually leaving dust trails, so we just climbed off to 20 feet so we didn't leave any dust trails." The link to that great interview is in the description. At no point during the Red Flag exercises were fighters able to get a lock on the fast, low-flying Buccaneers, which impressed the Americans to such a degree that they were invited back the following year and pioneered the RAF participation in future Red Flag exercises. Although the RAF had complete confidence in the sturdiness of the Buccaneer, the punishing nature of low-level flight, high-speed flight, would eventually take its toll on even the most robust airframe, even one milled out of a block of steel. In 1979, the entire Buccaneer fleet was grounded when, in July of that year, Buccaneer XW526 crashed near Osnabrück after losing its starboard wing in a gentle turn. The subsequent investigation determined that metal fatigue was the cause of the crash. A year later, at the 1980 Red Flag event, the Buccaneers were back in Nellis in a simulated attack when XV345 lost its entire starboard wing. The aircraft rolled into the desert floor, killing its crew. The investigation into this crash revealed once more that metal fatigue was the cause. After this, all the RAF Buccaneers were examined, and they found that 2/3 had similar cracks in the same locations in either one or both wings. 2 solutions were found to remedy the problem. The first was to replace the S2's larger triangular wingtips, which created an additional 2 to 3% stress, with the S1 square tips, and also shave off or cut away the cracks in the metal. Fatigue inspections would now happen more frequently throughout the entire remainder of the Buccaneer's life. After Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, the British launched Operation Granby, and the RAF swiftly assembled a presence in the region as part of the Allied coalition. Initially, the Buccaneers were not included, since it was decided that the RAF Tornado GR1s would be handling the low-level attack missions. However, on January 23, 1991, the Buccaneers, which some had considered obsolete, were unexpectedly tasked with providing laser designation for the Tornado squadrons, because it was discovered that although the Tornado JP-233 low-altitude airfield attack system was an effective weapon, it had to be deployed at low level, which exposes the crews to Iraq's lethal anti-aircraft defenses, which led to several Tornadoes being lost to anti-aircraft guns and a man-pad. The air chiefs decided that bombing missions would now take place at medium altitude, but dropping a 1,000-pound unguided bomb from a fast-moving aircraft at 20,000 feet is apparently a lot harder than it looks, so they called in the best aircraft capable of laser marking targets. On the 23rd of January, RAF Lossiemouth received a call and was asked to start preparing a squadron of Buccaneers to be flown to the Gulf. 14 were ultimately assembled, with 6 aircraft together with the most experienced crews, ready to go within 3 days. In that time, the Buccaneers had been repainted in desert pink with the Jolly Rogers flag, captioned Sky Pirates nose art, and fitted with new secure radios, updated IFF transponders, along with flare and chaff pods. The first 2 Buccaneers departed from Lossiemouth on January 26, 1991, for a 9-hour flight to Murak in Bahrain, with additional aircraft following in the next few days. Along the way, the Buccaneers picked up some additional and interesting nose art accompanied by names such as Guinness Girl, Miss Jolly Roger, and Sea Witch. Sorry, I've had to blur out some of the images, being too racy for YouTube, and frankly, I don't want to get demonetized since I need the shekels. With air superiority secured, the Tornadoes shifted focus to disrupting Iraqi army supply lines, targeting bridges over the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. On February 2nd, 2 Buccaneers, with their paved spike laser markers, guided 4 Tornadoes in a bombing the Al-Suwara road bridge, which spanned the Euphrates. The attack was so precise that there was little or no damage to the surrounding area. This mission set the standard for many others, and by February 8th, 6 more Buccaneers arrived, allowing more frequent attacks. Fearing a last-ditch effort from the Iraqi Air Force, southern airfields became prime targets, and Buccaneers played a significant role. Notably, on February 27th, they destroyed 2 Antonov AN-12 transports and captured Kuwaiti Hercules at Sheikh Mazar airfield. The Buccaneers eventually gave up their sidewinders as air superiority had been achieved and replaced them with 1,000-pound Paveway 2 laser-guided bombs that the Buccaneers would drop following a tornado bomb drop, where they would dive in from 25,000 feet and release their bombs on targets illuminated using their own designator pod. By the war's end, Buccaneers had flown 216 combat sorties, dropping 48 laser-guided bombs, and marking 169 targets for Tornadoes, Jaguars, and Dutch F-16s. In total, 24 bridges were destroyed. Not too bad for an aircraft that was not even initially considered to take part in the war. On March 17, 1991, 12 Buccaneers flew back to Lossiemouth, arriving back home on a typical overcast day. Sadly, most of the nose art was painted over. The Buccaneer became NATO's most potent anti-shipping attack aircraft and was expected to be in service until the late 1990s. However, post-Cold War defense reviews led to some Tornado GR-1 aircraft being modified to carry Sea Eagle, replacing the Buccaneers in maritime roles. The phase-out began with the disbandment of 237 OCU on October 1, 1991, redistributing its Buccaneers to 2 operational squadrons. On January 1, 1993, 12 Squadron transitioned from Buccaneers to Tornadoes after 23 years of service. Despite the reduction of the Lossiemouth wing, 208 Squadron, the RAF's last Buccaneer unit, faced increased demand, supporting numerous exercises and Royal Navy operational workups. In February 1994, 208 Squadron deployed to Gibraltar for its final detachment, providing air targets for the Royal Navy's principal weapon officer course on HMS Liverpool, a Type 42 destroyer. As the final Buccaneer Squadron, 208, organized a final grand farewell, 7 aircraft were repainted to represent every RAF Buccaneer Squadron, and 1 bore the Royal Navy colours of 809 Squadron. Squadron Commander, Wing Commander Nigel Huckings, led the final farewell formations during the weekend of March 26 to 27, 1994. Over 1,100 former RAF and Royal Navy personnel and their families attended the event. On March 31, 1994, 208 Squadron was decommissioned, ending the Buccaneers' 30-plus years of operational service and signaling the retirement of the Hunter from RAF service. In the end, 206 Buccaneers were built, flying for some 33 years. Despite being designed for the Royal Navy, it was with the Royal Air Force, in spite of themselves, that helped in creating the legend. On the 1st of April 1997, the Buccaneer made its final departure from the skies over England. To this day, the Buccaneer holds a special place in the hearts of the crew who flew her, the ground crew who tirelessly maintained her, and the millions of us who fell in love with the banana jet.